How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 12th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the section concerning retrospective linguistics, finishing off Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics. This section is split into 5 chapters, so we should be able to get through it all today. It begins with the 2 perspectives of diachronic linguistics, then the oldest language and the prototype, moves on to reconstructions, and the contribution of language to anthropology and prehistory. Then finally, but not all leastly, language families and linguistic types. He starts out by laying out a distinction between synchronic linguistics, dealing with meaning, grammar, and specific points in a language's evolution, and diachronic linguistics, the study of a language's evolution. In his words,
synchronic linguistics has only the perspective of speakers, and thus only one method. Diachronic linguistics, however, requires both a prospective and a retrospective viewpoint.
The prospective method follows the actual course of events, simply concerning itself with examining available documents. This method fails to fully account for the needs of diachronic linguistics, since, in order to give a detailed description of language throughout time, one will need an essentially infinite number of documents to account for language's vastness. It amounts to a simple narration based on textual criticism. This is why the retrospective method is so important. Instead of moving with time, the retrospective viewpoint seeks to retrace it. In order to do this, it must be a reconstructive method based on comparison. It is impossible to take a single sign and establish its origin, but by comparing it to another sign, it becomes much easier. For example, through Latin pater and Sanskrit pater, we are able to establish a shared identity between them, and thus the possibility of reconstructing their ancestors. This is how proto-languages like Proto-Indo-European are rebuilt after their death, long before the first written documents that the prospective method dealt with were created. Saussure now connects evolutionary linguistics to geology, another historical science. On this, he says,
before recounting what has occurred at a given point on the Earth, the geologist must reconstruct the chain of events and try to determine what is responsible.
This is exactly what a linguist ought to do whilst using the reconstructive method. He returns now back to the division between the two methods, stating that more than simply being divided sharply, to use the two at the same time would be a disadvantage. To demonstrate this point, he uses the example of phonetic changes. Using the perspective viewpoint, we may ask ourselves what in Latin became in French. We would see that it varied and gave rise to a multitude of different phonemes. If we take the diachronic view on the other hand, we would look the other direction and start from French seeing that it was the endpoint of numerous phonemes in Latin that were once distinct. These two pictures are completely different, and it would be impossible to take both paths at once. This brings us to the next chapter, the oldest language and the prototype. Saussure begins by going over a mistake that plagued the first Indo-European scholars. This mistake was overestimating the role of Sanskrit as the language most closely related to Proto-Indo-European. The reason for this overestimation was that Sanskrit had the oldest known documents, the approach of those scholars being based in the prospective method. This brings us to the question of what exactly it means to say one language is older than another. Saussure lists 3 interpretations. Firstly, there is the notion that older refers to the starting point of a language. This is problematic in that it ignores the continuity of language's development. Older is meaningless in this case. Secondly, there is the idea that older refers to one language state being further in the past than another that's being compared with it. In Saussure's words,
thus the Persian of the Achaemenian inscriptions is older than the Persian of Ferdowsi.
In trying to reconstruct a past form of a language, it still isn't all that useful to use this definition of older. It's only in the case of 2 states of the same language that the older form is more valuable than the younger. Otherwise, it's useless. There's no reason to prioritize Old Church Slavonic, attested first in the 10th century, over Lithuanian, which was originally written down in 1540. The final interpretation Saussure offers is the concept of older as describing how close a language is to its prototype. Under this definition, the Lithuanian of the 16th century is much older than the Latin of the 3rd century BCE. Turning back to Sanskrit now, he says that it only counts as older in the 2nd and 3rd interpretations. Regardless, it was a mistake by the early linguists to have placed it at the head of the Indo-European languages. A very similar mistake, stemming from the notion of old as somehow being better, can be found in numerous different linguistic fields. For example, a specialist in Germanic languages may have no problem citing almost exclusively Gothic due to it having preceded in writing many other related languages. These mistakes essentially lead to a replacement of the proto-language by a descendant. Moving on, he says now that it's a very rare occurrence that two specimens of written language represent the same idiom at two different periods in history. Rather, it's more common for them to represent different interrelated dialects instead. For example, Biblical Gothic, Anglo-Saxon, and Old Norse are all dialects that point towards a common ancestor, Proto-Germanic. We can't assume that the oldest attested of these, Gothic, represents its heir, but rather we are able to construct the ancestor only through the intersection of all those different languages from different periods, as represented by this diagram. He ends the chapter by underlining this point once again. A may be the oldest attested form, but it's only through analyzing all five's convergences that we are able to reconstruct the prototype. This brings us to the third chapter, simply titled Reconstructions. It's composed of two subsections, the first being their nature and aim. He endeavors to show here that the only way we can reconstruct languages like Proto-Indo-European is through comparison. These comparisons can be between different languages, like Greek and Sanskrit, or even within the same language, like two radicals in Latin which share a common ancestor. In his words,
linguistic comparison is not simply a mechanical operation. It implies the bringing together of all relevant data.
It always results in a reconstruction of forms, although it must be noted that these forms only exist as conjecture, since it's impossible to definitively know what an unattested language sounds like. This is further nuanced by the fact that reconstruction can only lead to rather partial and abstract parts of words, although Saussure says it would be a mistake to write off their potential for creating general conclusions. To take the example of a partial observation, the Latin voiceless labiodental fricative f in fumus stood for the voiceless bilabial fricative f in Proto-Italic. This allows us to say that f had a place in the phonology of Proto-Italic as a general conclusion. The aim of reconstruction then, in Saussure's eyes at least, isn't to discover the old forms of words, but rather is to produce a set of conclusions that can be used to describe the older form as a whole. This takes us to the next subchapter, relative accuracy of reconstructions. Saussure's main concern is to point out that reconstructions are actually more trustworthy than is often given credit. He does this by offering three facts. Firstly, there's the fact that it isn't too difficult to delineate between different phonetic units. Secondly, language can only have a set number of phonemes, their phonemic inventory. This allows us to be fairly certain on which reconstructions make sense and which don't. Finally, there's the fact that being completely accurate doesn't quite matter. It's not really all that necessary to be certain on the exact pronunciation of a vowel, as long as there aren't any other closely related phonemes and as long as we separate it from all other vowels in the system. We arrive now at the penultimate chapter, the contribution of language to anthropology and prehistory. This section is split into 4 subchapters, beginning with language and race. This deals mainly with critiquing the notion that linguistic reconstruction can provide information about a nation's race, social relations, customs, and institutions. As the name of the subchapter suggests, he first attacks the idea that there exists a connection between racial and linguistic boundaries. This section is quite outdated, to say the least, but the main takeaway is that colonization and the fluidity of language and race leads to the connection being false. He ends the subsection by saying this.
Consanguinity and linguistic immunity apparently have no necessary connection, and we cannot draw conclusions from one and apply them to the other.
This leads us to the next subchapter, ethnic unity. Although it's impossible to learn about race through language, ethnicity is another thing entirely. By ethnicity, Saussure is referring to unity of things like religion, civilization, and common defense, to name a few. Social bonds tend to create a linguistic community and vice versa, and it is thus that we can learn at least a little about ethnic unity, kept together by a shared language, through reconstruction. For example, Through the independence of Etruscan and Latin, we can see that the two people groups that spoke the languages were independent. We move now to the penultimate section, linguistic paleontology. The guiding question he seeks to answer here is this.
Linguistic unity may allow us to predict social community, but does language reveal the nature of this common ethnic unity?
His response is almost contradictory to the last section, being that we can't expect language to do so for a myriad of reasons. The first is that etymology is often rather shaky. In his words, it's rare to find words with well-established origins. This is made even more of a problem due to the fact that words often change meaning when a people group moves location. Additionally, the absence of a current word for a thing doesn't mean that the society didn't have it, just that it no longer does. He offers the example of what he calls Asiatic languages, which lacked a word for to plow. This doesn't mean the speakers of these ill-defined languages didn't know of the process, just that they no longer used it or else carried it out under different names. A third cause for uncertainty is the existence of loanwords. His example is the word for hemp, which entered the Mediterranean languages late and the Northern European languages even later. However, the original name stuck around, being loaned from Laoshi language. As he says,
in many instances, the lack of extra-linguistic data doesn't allow us to ascertain if the presence of the same word in several languages is due to borrowing or is proof of a common original tradition.
This doesn't mean that we aren't able to gain some general information though. For example, through the abundance and nature of kinship terms across languages descended from Proto-Indo-European, we can tell that the institution of family was a complex and stable one. With that, we get to the last subsection of the chapter, linguistic type and mind of a social group. His point of inquiry here is whether or not reconstructed languages can give a view into the psychology of the social groups that spoke them. In his time, there was a popular notion that language reflected the psychology of a nation, but Saussure states that there's a major objection that faces this thesis, that psychological causes don't necessarily underlie linguistic procedures. What this means is that the psychology and linguistic change don't necessarily coincide. Linguistic change is more often than not accidental and based on chance, drawing from a phonetic change. It would be a mistake in Saussure's eyes to imagine that one day a nation just chooses to change how it thinks. With this, he ends chapter 4 and begins the very last chapter of the book, Language Families and Linguistic Types. Saussure begins by again underlining that language is not directly controlled by the minds of speakers. Here, he has a bone to pick with the notion of organizing languages according to linguistic types. To do so, in his eyes, is to act as if linguistic change is stable, when, as he has shown throughout this book, it is anything but. To borrow his words,
when we assume that there are permanent traits which neither time nor space can change in any way, we clash head-on with the fundamental principles of evolutionary linguistics.
Permanence exists only through sheer luck. Languages lose and develop different traits from their so-called parent languages all the time. There's no such thing as an immutable characteristic. Phonetic changes, developed through blind evolution, lead to alternation. In turn, the mind seizes upon those alternations and spreads them through analogy. Again, only through dumb luck. He ends the entire book by saying this.
From the incursions we have made into the borderlands of our science, one lesson stands out. The true and unique object of linguistics is language studied in and for itself.
It is with this that we finish our series on Course in General Linguistics, understanding the immanent nature of linguistics as a science. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time, we'll start our series on the Lacanian subject by Bruce Fink. Until then, bye.